hurry up and invite our next speaker. His name is Louie. He is the Scheme Compliance Manager at Nexi Group. So, Louie, if you want to turn on your camera as well, I'll hand the virtual floor over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for inviting me. My topic is well. It's linked to everything you've heard already today, but it's a bit different in its approach. So, um, as Christian mentioned, my name is Louis, and I'm here to talk about kind of how we use AI and ML within the sanctions compliance perspective, and that's talking about from the financial industry. So fact or fiction, because AI and ML gets thrown a lot around a lot. But really, what are we using in the day to day? I think that kind of gets a bit confusing. So yeah, so just to quickly run through what we're going to talk about during this presentation. I'll give you a brief introduction on myself, give you some key sanctions terms, a bit of sanctions history, and then we'll talk about the difference of the ML and AI and ML. Sorry for the typo here. And then how we try to utilize it as best as we can, and kind of what are some of the fears that we have with this technology in our kind of day-to-day life. So I am born in New York City. Originally, my grandparents are from Puerto Rico, so that explains my last name. I currently live in Copenhagen. I moved out here a little over 2 years ago for a position at Danske Bank. And as Christian also mentioned, I work for the Nexi Group currently. And I've been, right now I'm not doing or focusing on any financial crime or sanctions, but I was in that line of work for about 9 years. And I worked for a few different institutions, both in the United States and here in the Nordics. So, I know a lot of you guys here are more on the tech side, so I thought it would be a good idea to kind of talk to you a bit about what sanctions is and why why there's a few passionate nerds out there like myself who gravitate to this work. So um, and I believe it's quite prevalent in this in in this, I guess, day and age, lack of a better term, with the war going on in the Ukraine, and how sanctions are being utilized by virtually the world and trying to, coerce Russia to rethink their approach. So economic sanctions, as you can see here, I'm not going to read verbatim, but it's basically um, an approach that a group of people or countries or it has various kind of forms, but how we see it mostly today is you know a country, like you could say, the United States, with OFAC being kind of the main driver there, makes a lot of the decisions on whether they should apply pressure to other countries to kind of comply with what they feel is you know, um, the right approach morally or for different reasons, and kind of pressure them to make that change. And then group of countries, you could look at that as, the United Nations. They've been in the sanctions game for a long time, and I don't think they get you know, the the kind of respect they need, is because there's really no teeth behind the regulations that they set forth. It's set upon the different countries themselves to kind of drive that forward. Um, and you hear sanctions and embargo a lot, and so I threw in there embargo because embargo is you know similar to sanctions but slightly different because it's on specifically commercial activity. And blockade is essentially the physical manifestation of sanctions, right? So instead of using, a political tool, now you're blocking off ports, you're doing other things to kind of deter activities that you've decided that should be prohibited. Um, and now you're seeing the use of sanctions change. Well, it was kind of used in a way to reduce, physical warfare. So, it reduces the loss of life when it comes to, combat. I mean, if you look at some of the, unwanted effects of sanctions, where, those innocent ones that are living in the countries that are affected by this, if it's like you know, a country that's being sanctioned, you could see the people that live there, suffering because they're not getting some of the, the goods that they're used to receiving, and it's limited, and some people, unfortunately suffer from that. But that's, I guess, unintended collateral when they're talking about this. It's not the innocent people they're going after. Unfortunately, sanctions does affect more of the innocent and the less fortunate. The people that are that are targeted by sanctions are, those that are in power, those that, you know, are the ones that are kind of the elite. As you can see again from the example of the recent war in Ukraine, a lot of the sanctions are targeted at the oligarchs. So moving on, sanctions is nothing new. I know this has probably got on a lot of people's radar because of the recent issues with Russia and the annexations of Crimea, and now the war in Ukraine. Um, you know, Also the sanctions against North Korea, which is pretty widespread, and also the long-standing sanctions against Cuba that the United States has. But actually, the first recorded instance of sanctions and embargo happened way back in 432, 433, and what is ancient Greece today. Now, how has the use of sanctions evolved? You know, for a lot of the time, sanctions was just, like I said, it's a non-physical way to try to coerce a group of people or a country to adhere to kind of moral standards or whatever the reasoning is given. Um, but things have definitely ramped up, and what I like to highlight here is that, at least from the United States perspective, and I think the rest of the world started following as well, is that after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, you could see that there was a lot more attention given to sanctions. And around the same time as well, I guess hand in hand with money laundering and terrorist financing. And so the United States kind of really ramped things up, pressure on financial institutions to uh, really start doing the things that they've really hoped they were doing previous to these events, but now finding ways to ensure that happens. And one of the main ways they do that is by finding institutions or even threatening sanctions on companies that don't adhere to the kind of mandates they set forth and regulations they set forth. Um, and in addition to that, the sanctions have now, it was a lot of it was list based, but that's again scratching the bare minimum. I could talk about that all day. Um, but a lot of it is, who's sanctioning who and what are the kind of rules to follow and what that means, right? That means you could um, means you're stopping flow to a certain country and commodity or fiat currency. That could mean a lot of different things. So figuring out what exactly the action is intended when you see a potential match to the sanctioned entity or country or region, and then figuring out what to do with that and whatever appropriate reporting is needed to the competent authorities. But with Russia, back with the annexation of Crimea and now the current war, we're introduced to something called sectoral sanctions, where now it's focusing on certain commodities, certain currencies. So, um, you know, now you're seeing a lot more complexity involved because, the governments are trying to figure out ways to really put pressure on, who they want to, again, change their behavior. So that's one example of that. And, this slide here kind of gives you an idea of the complexity of sanctions and how it's changed over the years. and gives you kind of an illustration by country how things have ebbed and flowed, and kind of um, the the amount of entries that are on the list. So um, this is why we partner up with a lot of technical companies and vendors and solutions. We need a more way to cut out some of the noise or the false positives and really focus on the risk at hand. Um, and I won't go over this too much because it's been gone over before, and most of you are experts in the industry. Um, but you know, AI and mostly ML has been introduced into sanctions compliance and in anti-financial crime compliance to help with the problem I just mentioned before, cutting out a lot of the noise. Um, but the confusion of I'll go back a second, the confusion of why, or what we're actually using is that, AI is such a broad term that kind of gets thrown around a lot. But what we're utilizing right now, until maybe we figure out a way how to do it a bit better, is machine learning. And I'll go into more of that in a second. So technology meets sanctions compliance. Like I said, here are some of the issues that we face in our day to day. Previous speakers have mentioned, the human impact when it comes to addressing issues, whether it's fraud or whether whatever it may be. Sometimes you just throw people at the problem, and that just makes it impossible to maintain, both from a financial perspective, but also um, even from a manpower perspective. You can't always throw people at the problem, and I think that's really being recognized over the last couple of years. um, the increased risk of incorrect or um, incomplete data. Again, garbage data, garbage in, garbage out, as our previous speaker mentioned. That's something that we harp on a lot. We have to get the information right, or ensure in a periodic basis, or now there's something being thrown out as perpetual basis, that we could stay up to date on the right data so that we know what we're looking at. um, and yeah, reducing the false positives, because we want to be able to focus on the real risk and not the monotonous. Just what happens is that you have these first level analysts who are used to just clearing things because there's no risk. And since they do that quite frequently, then we run the risk of actually missing something because they're just kind of zoned out. So what solutions have we seen in our space so far is OCR technology, which has been used to look at documents, sales documents, trade finance documents, and kind of port over important information into our screening tools. So, the system itself kind of has an idea of what an invoice looks like and other documents look like. But then we have actual people in trade finance, training the machine or the robot to kind of understand, because a lot of these documents are very formal documents. So, okay, if it's this type of document, the name would always be here, or certain important information would be in this location. So that's how that's being utilized. Native language processing, yeah, just to kind of understand better when we see a transaction come through, and the purpose of the transaction. Sometimes it's in, it's not clear, or it's in a different language. So we use some of that technology to really understand, get a better understanding of what the issue is, or what the transaction's about. Um, and then robotic process automation, and this is kind of where we're really heavily using it today. Um, so I just want to kind of go over, and kind of what ties into the topic of this conversation is, fear versus reality, right? for a lot of people who don't know, and I saw some questions that or comments that came up in the chat today. It's like, are the quote unquote robots going to take over the world? How many jobs are they going to take away? And this conversation also comes up in our world in fighting financial crime. Um, and so the first question is, will AI or ML replace compliance officers? And yeah, there might be some first level analysts that, might not be needed anymore and made redundant. But I think what we have to realize is that the shift would be from those kind of very repetitive tasks, those people being moved to other tasks that are more kind of where you need people to really focus on. Um, as you know, to kind of train ML or AI, you need use cases and it has to follow, specific pattern each time. And we use that for those kind of lower level risk cases where, um, you know, let's say a first level, as to give you an example, a first level analyst after 3 or 5 or whatever times makes the same decision, then that gets put into the robot and the robot knows, okay, if I see the exact same transaction, all the data points are the same, and I've seen for, whatever that set amount of time is, they make the same repeated, kind of, um, decision on that transaction. Now I can make that I can make that same decision. So that's been a great help in that regard. But where it's not, we don't see it affecting the kind of real, more of the risk, not real risk, but more the risk that we have to review as humans, is that there's too much gray area. There's too many variables. What I mean by that is, something could look risky at face value, but when you do some research, you could tell, okay, this is explainable, this makes sense, or it's a false positive based on something, or, sometimes the business just accepts the risk and there's a risk exception made. So now we have to go ahead and release the transaction. So sometimes, because there's so many kind of decisions made is not so clear cut, it won't completely, wipe humans out from reviewing these types of alerts. You still need skilled staff to review this information, whether it's in the robot or not. So what I mean by that is, we have to constantly, check that that the robot is making the right decisions, that it hasn't gone awry. And what I mean by that is, depending on the data set, as you know, sometimes a bias could be, you know, the machine could just think that now certain things are a risk when you never really said that. So we have to constantly ensure that it's making decisions that we anticipate. Um, and that's something that's one ethical, but it's two is something that's required by the regulators, right? When they come in to ask you about your compliance program and you let them know you're using machine learning, they're going to want to know how it's utilized, what are the parameters, show some reporting around it to prove that it's working appropriately. So I think that's something to always good to keep in mind. Um, Also, within AML and sanctions, typologies always pop up, and as you know, criminals are one step ahead of law enforcement. So that's the same when it comes to anti-money laundering. So because we don't know these red flags ahead of time, it's always tough to kind of stay out ahead of it. Um, and yeah, so I know we're running short on time, so I'll just wrap up by saying that you know we shouldn't be afraid of technology. I know you guys are well aware of that, but I'm talking kind of for in general, for my community at least, that we need to work more with our tech providers to figure out the right solutions for our issues, not just for today, but going forward. What I always say is, you can't build a solution for today and just focus on that, because once you're finished with that, building that out, it's already obsolete. So you have to also keep an eye to the future as best you can. Nobody has a crystal ball, but a bit of horizon scanning should be involved when you're looking to implement a new tool, or bring in new data, or whatever it have be. Um, and yeah, I think ML is definitely helping us a lot. I'd be interested, for those of you on the call today who have opinions on how, you know, ML and AI can help even more, I'd be super interested in hearing that. From my perspective, I think it might be quite minimal because we can't fully automate things. But hey, I think it's about, like I said previously, about having an open mind and working with our tech partners a bit closer to figuring out better ways of working and not just throwing humans at the problem.